Okay, we're going to be talking about resurgence of infectious diseases today. I am going to be asking you to do discussion questions around this PowerPoint. So pay attention. I'm going to give it, this PowerPoint presentation should be about 15 to 20 minutes. And then you have video links that I want you to look at in the module. So the resurgence of infectious diseases is looking at how diseases are coming back. One of the big things we've always been tracking is HIV and AIDS. HIV and AIDS was first recognized in U.S. in 1981. It's considered a worldwide killer caused by a retrovirus. It attacks the immune system, which then starts to fail. And then diseases come in. People have a low immunity, and then different diseases come in. And then they die from AIDS, from an autoimmune disorder. There's a screening test that recognizes antibodies. So when someone is HIV positive, it's a reaction to their body responding to this virus. One big thing I think it's important to note, and I am going to be posting a link in there to PrEP. There are many drugs available to control it, but not cure it. And I'd like you to take a look at PrEP that recently was released by CDC and is a protocol for doctors and is very, very powerful in controlling the disease. HIV and AIDS is transmitted from sexual contact and sharing of needles. Typically homosexual sexual contact in the United States, but heterosexual contact is most common around the world. It's high-risk behavior such as sharing needles and then medical use of unsterile needles that also spreads HIV. And one of the things that in your questions they ask about how it's most at risk, and medical use of unsterile needles is something that is very common about, across the world in spreading this disease. So sterilizing needles is key in preventing this. Circumcision helps prevent men against contracting HIV from women, but doesn't protect women from contracting it from men. Women can be very exposed. Mother to infant is how it's passed down, and it's also important to note that if a mother is HIV positive, they can actually help provide drugs and things to keep the infant from becoming HIV. So that's something they can actually control. Blood transfusions are no longer a problem in the United States. In the early outbreak of this was a big issue in the 80s, but that's no longer now an issue. So where did HIV come from? Probably originated in Africa, and actually I read an article recently that they did some genetic testing and they pushed it all the way back to exposure from a monkey in Africa. So it definitely has had its origins from way, way back, years and years ago. Cross-species transmission from monkeys or apes. One of the ideas that they say that spread in the human population due to disruption of traditional lifestyles. And so let me translate that, because traditional lifestyles, what does this mean? It can mean anything to everybody. So I'm going to strike that and say that really it's about high-risk lifestyles. So high-risk lifestyles are unprotected sex, multiple sex partners, use of unclean needles, sharing needles. Okay, and so it came to the Western countries due to changing patterns of sexual behavior, but really also I want to stress international travel. They talk about, in your book, they talk about a steward who was an airplane steward who traveled all around. And when people travel, that's how diseases are spread. It's about exposure to diseases. The more someone's isolated, the more isolated the disease can be. So other emerging viruses are Ebola, monkeypox, hantavirus, hemorrhagic fevers, West Nile virus, and SARS. And so in your module, you'll see a link to hemorrhagic fevers And also there's a link to the Ebola virus and how CDC contained it. So these are some of the emerging viruses. And so I'd like you to watch the CDC video that I put in there about how they contained the Ebola virus and what they did to stop the spread. So please watch that video. Factors that lead to the emergence of new infectious diseases, so new ones, is that anytime a human is in close contact with wildlife, so these diseases pass back and forth. Modern agricultural practices, so like different exposures in the agricultural practices, genetic modifications, international travel is another one. Distributions of food and exotic animals that are exotic. So you know how like when if you're traveling outside of California and you come across and you're coming into California, they'll say, are you carrying any fruits or vegetables? They're trying to control the new diseases coming in. And that goes for food and exotic animals that are carrying new pathogens and new types of viruses and bacteria that maybe we don't have the immune system to fight. Breakdown of social restraints on sexual behavior and intravenous drug use. And I want to say that basically that breaks down into unprotected sex. And when it comes to intravenous drug use, that is translating into sharing unclean needles. So those two things, unsafe sex, not having protection during sex, having multiple partners, and using unclean needles. And what we find with heroin use and drug use is that people share needles and the disease spreads. So influenza, and it's interesting, I've been overhearing people talk about how sick they've been getting with the flu. So, and someone could have the flu shot and very much get sick. It's an RN virus, just like HIV. It's constantly mutating, so it means it's constantly changing its form. And so that's the reason why the flu shot can sometimes be very effective, because they're taking past flu viruses and formulating a vaccine to treat that particular flu strand. But it mutates, and the next year there's a new strand, and the flu shot helps protect, I've heard, up to 30% of flu strands. But what about that other 70%? And there's always new lethal strands appearing periodically. You need to look at 1918 and 1919. It killed 20 million to 40 million people nationwide. So the flu can kill. And remember, there was a concern about the bird flu, H1N1. Do you remember that? So that was something that also came up. But let's talk about also, that's all viral, right? Viruses. But we also have new bacterial threats. Legionnaire's disease are coming back up. These are not new bacteria. They've been around, but they're emerging again. Legionnaire's disease, Lyme disease. You can see the different list here. Group A, E. coli. But one of the big things that they're starting to see is antibiotic resistance. And I'm going to be asking about that in your discussion question. And this is from improper medical use of antibiotics in agriculture, MRSA. And then, so what I've done is I put a link in here about how antibiotic resistance happens. And I'd love for you to watch that link if you want to go out to it. I also posted, this is from the epidemiologist. She was in our class, and she posted information on the 3 big antibiotic resistance bacteria that they're really starting to worry about, and they're starting to see come up. So here we go. We get the national survey data, and then you can see the slide here about how many people are being impacted, and the 3 different types of bacterial strands that they're starting to watch. And you notice at the very bottom one, do you see the gonorrhea one? Yes, gonorrhea has is starting to become bacterial resistant. And that's really pertinent for this county, which has some of the highest gonorrhea rates of sexually transmitted disease, gonorrhea in the state, and we have a bacterial resistant strand that is out there. So that is dangerous. So all three of these are on the radar screen. But how do you prevent antibacterial resistance? How do you prevent it? So this is like decreasing the use of antibiotics and treat when needed, completing the entire treatment. So if you have a Z pack and they're 5, you got to take the whole pack. Can't share antibiotics, because what that does is that person can't do a complete treatment, or maybe they don't even need it, which makes it worse, because now you're giving them antibiotics when they don't need it, and they start to build up a resistance. Decrease use in agricultural areas of antibiotics. Wash your hands. There's something about just even washing your hands and getting rid of that bacteria just by friction and washing it off and reducing your exposure. Keeping up with vaccines that to reduce chance of getting sick and getting an infection. So taking and making sure that your vaccines are up to date so that you don't get sick and then an infection, and bacteria doesn't grow from just getting sick, okay? So imagine, you get a viral infection. You probably have had this happen. Get the flu, and then you're all congested, and it's not getting better, and then all of a sudden, weeks later, you have a sinus infection. So it's the same idea. Not getting infected with the virus is key in reducing your exposure to possibly getting sick later with the bacteria. Okay, so tuberculosis is really another big cause. It's a leading cause of infectious disease worldwide. 1/3 of the population is infected. And so now you can see why a lot of times you had to, before you could start working somewhere, you had to have a TB test. There was a resurgence in the US in the 1990s. It's definitely people more at risk if they have HIV. It's transmitted by aerosol. So what that means is that if you could imagine an aerosol spray, there are particulate matters that are really big droplets in the air. And so it could be picked up that way. And there's a 50% fatality rate for people who are not treated. So that's a high fatality rate. So here are some other things to keep in mind. And that there actually can be a tuberculosis that is bacterial resistant. So here are the different bullet points there. Prions is the next thing, and it is a protein that acts as a pathogen, gets into the brain and starts to and different parts of your body, and it starts to create problems and create different diseases. I put an article, the Scientific American article, for you guys to read, and I posted it in the module. So read up on prions in the module. But here's a public health response to emerging infections. This is how we control it, and this is where your discussion question will be. Global surveillance, really tracking diseases, making sure if they start to outbreak, that we have an outbreak, that we quarantine, that we close it off. Making sure that we have public health capacity. So like if a disease all of a sudden has an outbreak, that we have the ability to shut things down, that we have hospitals, that we have places to control it. Veterinary surveillance, this is really interesting. So for those vets, really tracking diseases that are in the dogs and cats and in different animals so we can control it not hitting the human population. Reduce the inappropriate use of antibiotics, so really educating people that they have to complete all their antibiotics, that sometimes they will not get antibiotics because it's a viral infection. We need to constantly stay vigilant on creating new vaccines, that we need new macrobiotic drugs, and that we need to control vector-borne and animal-borne diseases. Again, this is controlling those animals that are carrying diseases. We also have to worry about the threat of bioterrorism. So we have to look at that too, because sometimes people might just also bring some of these bacterial strands out and these viruses out and plant them out there to get it started again. For example, we've eradicated smallpox, but if someone got a hold of that smallpox strand and decided to spread it, it would be an absolute epidemic. So the threat of bioterrorism is real. So here are your discussion questions, and you're going to see it. Considering the spread of the following emergency infectious disease. So what I'm going to ask you to do is pick one, explain one disease, and explain how can the chain of infection be interrupted. So take one disease like Ebola, hantavirus, influenza, define it, tell us what it is, and tell us how you can break the chain of infection. So to get your idea about how to answer this question, I would watch the CDC Ebola outbreak and how they controlled it. So that's just one idea. The next discussion question, and this one is just for you to think about. What are the reasons for the rapid emergence of AIDS as a worldwide epidemic? Why do you think AIDS is coming back? And it's coming, you have to think back to how diseases are spread. So think about that question. And the last one is, what are 3 public health measures that could reduce the probability that bacteria will develop resistance to antibiotics? So we're going to have a discussion question around this one also. So I think discussion question 1 is going to be your assignment, and discussion question number 3 is going to be open to discussion. I want to see what people think. All right, great. I look forward to seeing your answers. So and look forward to seeing your assignments. So now I'm going to go ahead and get out of this and come out to here. And I'm going to take a look at all the things that we have to do this week. I'm going to be posting, let's see here. Let me get back to share screen. And I want to make sure that you see in here, I'm going to be posting the video. Here's the link to the CDC video, how CDC is controlling against hemorrhagic fevers, how people have also, this is to help you answer your question about how to control diseases. You can look how people use fogging, basically spraying for mosquitoes to reduce exposure to different fevers. The guest lecture for the epidemiologist will be here, and I also posted a little bit of video from her production so you can see how she talked about tracing of a disease going back all the way to patient 0. So watch those. Here's the prion explained. Here's an epidemiology, and then I'm going to be posting your discussion question in your assignment here. Okay, if you have any questions or you need any help, feel free to Canvas message me or give me an email. I'm here. All right, Canvas message me, or you can also text me on the Google text. Have a great week, and I look forward to seeing your answers.